Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. We begin on Capitol Hill, where lawmakers remembered Arizona Senator John McCain. McCain's desk on the Senate floor was covered with black fabric with a vase of white roses in the middle. Several senators took to the floor to share their memories of McCain and express what his legacy meant to the American people. Here's some of what Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said.
For his colleagues here, the time confirmed a sad but obvious truth. The Senate won't be the same without John McCain. Because while John proudly served with us as the Senator for Arizona, he was America's hero all along. I will miss one of the very finest gentlemen with whom I've had the honor to serve. But we will not forget him. I consider it our privilege to return some small share of the love that John poured out for this country.
Earlier in the day, McCain's former presidential campaign manager and longtime confidant, Rick Davis, read the senator's final letter to the American people. In it, McCain called himself the luckiest person on earth and expressed his love and pride for his family.
Thank you for the privilege of serving you and for the rewarding life that service in uniform and in public office has allowed me to lead. I've tried to serve our country honorably. I've made mistakes, but I hope my love for America will be weighed favorably against them. 10 years ago, I had the privilege to concede defeat in the election for president. I want to end my farewell to you with heartfelt faith in Americans that I felt so powerfully that evening. I feel it powerfully still. Do not despair of our present difficulties. We believe always in the promise and greatness of America, because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history. Farewell, fellow Americans. God bless you, and God bless America.
Several days of remembrance ceremonies are planned for McCain. He will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol later this week. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is also proposing renaming the Russell Senate Office Building after the late senator. Both Schumer and McConnell requested that all U.S. flags remain at half-staff through McCain's burial on Sunday. However, the White House flag was seen at full staff Monday morning after flying at half-staff for part of Sunday. The flag was lowered back to half-staff later in the afternoon. President Trump ignored several questions about McCain that were shouted at him by reporters at the White House Monday.
Mr. President, any thoughts on John McCain? The American Legion has asked you to lower the flags to half-staff. Any reaction to the American Legion? Any action to the American Legion asking you to put a proclamation about John McCain? Why won't you say anything about John McCain?
Let's go. Make your way out. Let's go. Press. Let's go. We're finished. Let's go.
Thank you very much.
President Trump finally addressed McCain's death on camera at an evangelical dinner he hosted at the White House Monday night.
Also, our hearts and prayers are going to the family of Senator John McCain. Going to be a lot of activity over the next number of days, and we very much appreciate everything that Senator McCain has done for our country. So thank you very much.
Joining me now are CBSN political contributor and political reporter for The Guardian, Sabrina Siddiqui, and senior congressional correspondent for The Washington Post, Paul Kane. Thanks to you both for joining us. Sabrina, let me start with you. The funeral plans for Senator McCain will span the better part of this week. What does that say about Senator McCain's legacy?
Well, I think we've seen tributes pour in from across the globe praising Senator McCain, not just for the 6 decades of service he held in Congress, but also, of course, as a decorated Vietnam War hero. He, of course, spent, as we all know, 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. And he really does represent this old guard in Washington who I think spent the last few years, certainly amid the rise of then-candidate Trump and now President Trump, trying to warn against the country going into another direction that broke from a lot of the norms and the institutions that he believes he fought to uphold. So I think that you are seeing a reflection of that in the respect that he's received from both sides of the aisle and the way in which he will be memorialized in the course of this coming week. And yet again, that is what made the response from the White House so striking, that even in this moment, it took the president 2 days to issue a statement and a proclamation that any of his predecessors would have done in the immediate moments after we learned of Senator McCain's passing.
And we should note that the president did that after the American Legion, which represents millions of U.S. veterans, actually asked President Trump to do so. Paul, let me turn to you. In a recent piece, you called Senator McCain a, quote, force of nature in Washington with an unrivaled global stature. What type of void does his death create on Capitol Hill?
McCain was really the last of the great Senate chairmen that really sort of drove this place in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They have all literally retired or died off, people like Ted Kennedy. These were the forces of nature who, even if leadership, their own party leadership, didn't support what they were doing, these guys could get their bills onto the floor and at least get debate. John McCain, back in 1998 and 99, he got stuff like tobacco reform legislation, campaign finance reform. He would, through the sheer force of his character, got bills onto the floor, and even if leadership was opposed to them, he could still get a debate going. Nowadays, it's so much more of a top-down structure in which, Mitch McConnell today boasts about he is the decider of what gets onto the House floor. You just don't have people like that anymore who are able to sort of build their own coalition and just sort of steamroll leadership. It's basically now just a top-down institution.
Well, Sabrina, let me ask you, former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama will deliver eulogies at Senator McCain's funeral. What's the significance of that, where you have not just a Republican and a Democrat, but the two men who essentially ended Senator McCain's presidential bids, that they are the ones he specifically chose to eulogize him?
I think a lot of that goes back to the way in which Senator McCain viewed public service. And to Paul's point, he was very much one of the last great statesmen in American politics. And so a lot of what you see in terms of the support and the outpouring of affection that's come from both of those predecessors, his former political opponents, Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, has to do with honoring that legacy and what he stood for. As is the case with any politician, he wasn't perfect, and he acknowledged that in his parting words. The letter that was released today, he certainly was not immune to criticism, but one thing that he respected was the democratic process in this country and the fact that Americans ultimately twice chose another leader to be ultimately elevated to the White House. And when you think about just the way in which he did advocate for being gracious, even in the face of defeat, that is a lot of, I think, also why he has taken issue with President Trump and the way in which he has governed, the way in which he has simply not shown himself to be willing to follow suit in the same way of civility that really, I think, ruled the way in which McCain approached at least his outlook when it came to public service.
Well, and Paul, it's interesting, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York is pushing to rename the Russell Senate Office Building after Senator McCain. What does it say that you have a Democrat trying to rename a building after a Republican? And also, how likely do you think it is that Schumer will be successful?
Yeah, I'm standing here in the Russell Building itself, on the third floor of the Russell Building. We believe it only takes a act of the Senate. I don't think this needs to be a full legislative issue, but apparently Mitch McConnell is not rushing to join Schumer in that idea. I think he wants to talk to his colleagues about it. This has been talked about for a while. Richard Russell had some real sort of segregationist views when he was a Southern Democrat, and I think Schumer sees it as sort of a healing gesture to all sides. sides. He would be replacing a Democrat with a Republican in the building, but it would be somebody who tried to view his role as somebody that really forged unity. And I think you pretty much saw that, and one of the reasons you've got Obama up there speaking is because McCain was so gracious in defeat in 2008 in that concession speech, and it's his sort of way of trying to bring the country together. And I think Schumer is trying to do that with this building that I'm standing in to try and make another gesture toward that same unity.
Paul, I'm curious, though, what would be the arguments against such a gesture? I mean, I know obviously this is still very early yet, but it's interesting that you say Senator McConnell is not necessarily sort of rushing to join Senator Schumer in this effort.
Yeah. This has been an ongoing effort for about 15 years or so. There were some activists, civil rights activists, early this century, 2002, 2003, that were trying to do this. And there were defenders of Russell who said that was his views on segregation were just only a small part of what he stood for. And there were some that believed at the time that he was a great figure for helping the military. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, which McCain himself has now been chairman of for several years. That's been just a sort of touchy, dicey subject. You know, I think senators from Georgia will want to have to weigh in on this. It's just unclear right now. It's a little too soon to know whether folks will all uniformly join in on this.
Interesting. Well, switching topics now, President Trump announced that the United States and Mexico reached a deal to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement. Sabrina, what details do we know about this trade agreement?
As is often the case, there was a great deal of pomp and circumstance around the announcement, but little by way of substance, because the fact of the matter is there is not a new deal that has been agreed upon between the United States and Mexico. What the two countries have come to an agreement on is a framework, at least in principle, in order to try and resolve some of the key differences that they hold with respect to NAFTA. Now, there have been ongoing negotiations with respect to NAFTA between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada since the Trump administration came in more than a year and a half ago that have yet to produce a new agreement. And one thing that was notable was that the Mexican president, Enrique Nieto, said very clearly today that he still believes that any new agreement would have to involve the participation of Canada, whereas the White House is framing this as having forged two new bilateral agreements, one with Mexico and another pending with Canada, when there simply isn't any evidence yet to support that we are yet at that stage. So we have to wait and see what may be forthcoming. But as we've seen time and again, they have a tendency to go through with a rollout that seems to show or demonstrate that the work is done when we don't actually yet know what the fine print is, or even what the framework itself will ultimately mean in terms of an actual change in policy.
And Paul, a new trade agreement requires congressional approval. What are some of the hurdles it will have to overcome on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think the overall tone Congress was happy to see. At least it was cordial toward Mexico, considering where Trump had been in the campaign and his early days as president. So they appreciated the nice tone, but there's a lot of details left to be filled in. And this is a Congress that has shown time and again it struggles with some of the most basic legislative hurdles. A trade agreement with Mexico is a really big deal, and I have a hard time seeing any type of approval of that happening at least until next year. We're in election season up here, and they're just trying to get through some of the most basic things for the next couple of months. And then who knows who's going to control the majority next year. There are a whole host of issues, unknowns, that would have to be answered before we get to a congressional approval.
Far more complicated, I think, than folks might understand. Sabrina Siddiqui and Paul Kane, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure.